The 17th of January 1940, Washington, D.C. The munitions building stands cold and grey against a colourless winter sky. Inside, in a cramped office thick with cigarette smoke and the rustle of classified folders, a handful of naval officers stare at reconnaissance photographs spread across a marshstand table. The images show something unsettling. German dive bombers plummeting through British anti-aircraft fire, untouched, deadly, surgical. The shells burst too early or too late, blossoms of smoke and shrapnel blooming uselessly in empty sky. In the corner of the room, a mechanical clock ticks, each second a reminder that across the Atlantic, men are dying because their weapons cannot reach fast enough, cannot think fast enough. One officer taps his finger on a photograph of a shattered British destroyer, its deck peeled open like a tin can. He says nothing. There is nothing left to say. The numbers speak for themselves. In 1940, it took an average of 2,500 anti-aircraft shells to bring down a single enemy aircraft, 2,500 attempts to stop one machine. And with each passing month, the aircraft grew faster, the bombers more daring, the mathematics of survival more desperate. This was not merely a problem of marksmanship. It was a crisis of time itself. A dive bomber travelling at 300 miles per hour, descending at a near vertical angle, gave a gunner mere seconds to calculate speed, altitude, trajectory, and wind. The human brain, no matter how trained, could not process fast enough. The mechanical fuse, no matter how precisely machined, could not adapt. It was set before the gun fired, a blind guess frozen into steel and powder. If the guess was wrong, and it almost always was, the shell exploded in the wrong cubic meter of sky, and the bomber continued its plunge, and the ship burned, and the men drowned. This was the arithmetic of 1940. This was the equation that demanded an answer before the war came to American shores. But the story of the proximity fuse does not begin in 1940. It begins much earlier, in the stubborn architecture of warfare itself, in the ancient dream of hitting what moves. For centuries, gunners fired at static targets or slow-moving columns. The cannonball arced predictably. The musket volley met the marching line, but the airplane shattered that geometry. It introduced the third dimension, speed without pattern, attack from angles that defied the old rules. And so the fuse, that small mechanical timer buried in the nose of every anti-aircraft shell, became the weakest link in the chain of survival. In the First World War, anti-aircraft fire was more spectacle than solution. Shells burst in the sky like fireworks, impressive and largely useless. Pilots learned to fly through the flak, knowing the odds favoured them enormously. By the 1,930 seconds, fuses had improved spring-driven clockwork mechanisms that could be set to detonate at a specific altitude, but the fundamental limitation remained. The fuse was deaf and blind. It knew nothing of the target. It exploded when the clock ran out, whether the enemy was near or not. A pilot could dive, climb, jink left or right, and the shells that should have killed him would blossom harmlessly behind, above, below. The sky was vast. The margin for error was unforgiving. American naval officers understood this. They had watched the newsreels from Europe. They had read the after-action reports from British destroyers, limping back to port with superstructures shredded, crews decimated. They knew what was coming. The oceans would not protect them forever. If war came when war came, American ships would face the same screaming dive bombers, the same torpedo planes skimming low over the waves, the same impossible geometry of speed and altitude. And the 5-inch guns bristling from American decks, for all their polish and precision, would fire shells with fuses no smarter than those the British were using. Shells that exploded on schedule, indifferent to whether the target was still there. So, in the winter of 1940, before Pearl Harbor, before America was even at war, a quiet and desperate search began. It was not widely publicized. It did not make headlines. But in the basement laboratories of the Naval Research Laboratory, in the offices of the National Defense Research Committee, and in the cramped workshops of private contractors, scientists and engineers began chasing an idea that seemed, to many, impossible. They wanted to build a fuse that could sense its target, a fuse that could wait, patient and silent, until the enemy was close enough, and then detonate itself in the perfect instant. A fuse that could think. The idea was not entirely new. As early as 1918, inventors had proposed radio wave detection systems for fuses. Patents were filed, prototypes were sketched. But the technology was too fragile, too unreliable, too large. A fuse had to fit inside the nose of a shell no wider than 5 inches. It had to survive the catastrophic acceleration of being fired from a gun forces exceeding 20,000 times the pull of gravity, enough to shatter glass, warp steel, and pulverize delicate electronics. It had to withstand the spin of the shell as it rifled through the barrel, rotating hundreds of times per second. It had to function in rain, in salt spray, in sub-zero cold and tropical heat. And it had to be cheap enough to manufacture by the millions, because wars are won not by prototypes but by production. In 1940, these demands seemed contradictory, perhaps irreconcilable. Radio tubes were fragile things, evacuated glass bulbs with filaments as fine as spider silk. The idea of putting one inside an artillery shell and firing it at supersonic speed was, to most engineers, absurd. But the men who gathered in those smoke-filled rooms were not interested in what was reasonable. They were interested in what was necessary. One of them was Merle Tuve, a physicist from the Carnegie Institution. Tuve was thin, intense, a man who spoke in precise sentences and thought in equations. He had spent the 1,930 seconds studying the ionosphere, bouncing radio waves off the upper atmosphere to map its invisible architecture. Now he turned that knowledge toward a different problem. If a radio wave could detect the ionosphere, could it detect an airplane? And if it could detect an airplane, could it trigger a fuse? The principle was simple. A tiny radio transmitter inside the shell would emit a signal. If the signal bounced back, if it reflected off metal, off the skin of a bomber, the returning wave would interfere with the outgoing wave, creating a change in frequency. That change could be measured. And if it crossed a certain threshold, it could close an electrical circuit, and that circuit could fire a detonator. Simple in principle, staggeringly complex in execution. The first attempts failed. The tubes shattered on firing, the circuits corroded, the batteries died. The transmitters, even when they survived, were not sensitive enough to detect a target until the shell had already passed it. Week after week, the team fired test rounds into the Chesapeake Bay, and week after week, the shells plunged uselessly into the water, silent and inert. There were arguments, there was frustration. There were moments when the entire project seemed like a costly distraction, a scientific fantasy pursued while real ships burned in real oceans. But Tuve and his team kept working. They redesigned the tubes, making them smaller, sturdier, using new filaments that could bend without breaking. They replaced batteries with tiny wind-powered generators that spun in the airstream as the shell flew, harvesting energy from the shell's own motion. They simplified the circuitry, stripping away everything non-essential until what remained was lean and brutal and functional. And slowly, grudgingly, the technology began to work. By the summer of 1941, they had a prototype that survived firing. By autumn, they had a prototype that detected targets. And by the end of the year, as Japanese bombs fell on Pearl Harbor and America plunged into the war it had been dreading, the proximity fuse was real. Not perfect, not mass-produced, but real. The first combat test came in January 1943, in the South Pacific. The cruiser USS Helena, steaming through waters thick with the threat of Japanese air attack, loaded her 5-inch guns with shells no one on board had seen before. The shells looked ordinary grey steel, stenciled markings, the same weight and heft as standard rounds. But inside each nose cone, nestled in foam and wax, was a radio fuse, a cluster of components so small and so sophisticated that it represented a revolution in miniaturization, in ruggedness, in applied physics. The gun crews were told only that these were special shells, and that they should be used against aircraft when the moment came. The moment came at dusk. Japanese bombers, twin-engine Bettys, emerged from a bank of clouds, low and fast, skimming toward the American fleet. The Helena's guns swung to track them. The crews loaded, trained, fired. The shells screamed upward, their trajectories calculated by fire control computers, their speeds measured in thousands of feet per second. And as they passed near the enemy aircraft, they exploded, not by clockwork, not by chance, but by proximity. The radio waves kissed the metal skin of the bombers, and the fuses woke, and the shells tore themselves apart in clouds of shrapnel, and the bombers came apart in the air, wings shearing off, fuselages crumpling, flames streaming behind them as they tumbled into the sea. The gun crews stared. They had never seen anything like it. Shells that seemed to know where the enemy was. Shells that hunted. The rate of kills per round fired jumped from 1 in 2,500 to 1 in 100, then 1 in 50. The mathematics of air defense had changed overnight. But the true impact of the proximity fuse was not just tactical, it was psychological. For years, Axis pilots had learned to trust the sky, to know that if they were fast enough, aggressive enough, they could push through the flak. The shells were dangerous, yes, but they were also stupid. They exploded on schedule, and a skilled pilot could dance between the bursts. But the proximity fuse changed that calculus. Now the shells adapted, now they waited. A pilot could no longer rely on speed alone. The sky itself had become intelligent, hostile in a new and unnerving way. German and Japanese forces did not immediately understand what was happening. They noticed the increased lethality, the sudden jump in losses over American fleets, but they attributed it to better training, better gun directors, better luck. It was not until later, when unexploded shells were recovered from the field and carefully dissected, that the truth emerged. The Allies had built a fuse that could sense its target. The implications were staggering. If the Allies could do this, if they could miniaturize radio technology to this degree, if they could make electronics rugged enough to survive the violence of gunfire, what else could they do? For the Germans, the discovery was a bitter confirmation of what they had begun to suspect, that American industrial and scientific capacity was not just vast, but innovative in ways that the Axis powers, for all their early technological advantages, could not match. Germany had pioneered radar, had built the first operational jet fighters, had designed rockets that would later reach space, but the proximity fuse was different. It was not a single breakthrough, but a synthesis of breakthroughs: materials, science, miniaturization, mass production, quality control. It required not just genius, but infrastructure, not just invention, but the ability to manufacture millions of units to exacting standards. And in 1943, America had that infrastructure. Germany, strangled by blockade and bombing, did not. The fuse became a symbol, though few realized it at the time. It was a small object, no larger than a fist, weighing less than a pound, but it represented something larger, the application of pure science to pure violence, the translation of theory into thunder. It was born in laboratories but proved itself in the skies over the Pacific, over the beaches of Normandy, over the factories of the Ruhr. It saved ships. It saved lives. And it changed the way wars would be fought forever. Consider the numbers. By the end of the war, American factories had produced more than 22 million proximity fuses. 22 million devices, each one a small radio station, each one a tiny brain capable of making a decision in the microseconds before its own destruction. The production line was itself a marvel, automated, precise, running 24 hours a day in plants scattered across the United States. Women who had never touched a soldering iron learned to assemble components smaller than a fingernail. Engineers devised testing rigs that could simulate the shock of firing, the spin of flight, the electromagnetic noise of combat. Every fuse was inspected, every fuse was tested, and the failure rate, which had been unacceptably high in the early months, dropped to less than 1%. This was American manufacturing at its zenith. Not just the ability to produce, but the ability to produce quality at scale, to turn a laboratory curiosity into a weapon that could be trusted by every gunner on every ship in every theatre of war. The Germans tried to replicate it. They captured American shells, dissected the fuses, studied the circuits, but they could not reproduce it. They lacked the materials, the factories, the expertise in mass production. By the time they came close, the war was already lost. But there is another layer to this story, one that goes beyond tactics and production numbers. The proximity fuse was a harbinger of a new kind of warfare, a warfare where machines would begin to make decisions once reserved for humans. The fuse did not ask permission to detonate. It sensed, it calculated, it acted. It was the first weapon to operate, in a very limited sense, autonomously. A human pulled the trigger, but the fuse decided the moment of detonation. And in that small delegation of authority, in that tiny surrender of human control, there was a glimpse of the future, a future where weapons would grow smarter, faster, more capable of independent action. The soldiers and sailors who used the proximity fuse in combat did not think of it this way. To them, it was simply a better shell, a tool that made their jobs easier and their chances of survival higher. But the scientists who built it understood. They knew they had crossed a threshold. They knew that the boundary between tool and agent, between instrument and intelligence, had become thinner. There is a photograph from 1944 taken at the Naval Research Laboratory. It shows a small group of men standing around a workbench. On the bench is a proximity fuse, disassembled, its components laid out like the organs of a mechanical body. The men are smiling, tired, proud. One of them is Merle Tuve. He holds a radio tube in his hand, no larger than a thimble, and he looks at it the way a jeweler might look at a diamond. This small thing, this fragile thing, has helped turn the tide of a war. It has saved ships from bombs, sailors from drowning, cities from burning. And it has done so not through brute force, but through intelligence, through the ability to sense and respond in the instant that matters most. The war ended. The fuses were mothballed, stockpiled, studied. But the principles behind them did not disappear. They migrated into other technologies, into guided missiles, into radar-homing weapons, into the smart bombs and drones of later decades. The proximity fuse was the ancestor of every weapon that can sense its target, every munition that can adjust its course mid-flight. It was the first step on a long road toward automation, toward machines that do not just obey but decide. And yet, for all its sophistication, the proximity fuse was also profoundly simple. It did one thing, and it did it well. It waited until the enemy was close, and then it exploded. There was no hesitation, no second guessing. It was built for a single purpose, and it fulfilled that purpose with ruthless efficiency. In that sense, it was the perfect embodiment of American engineering philosophy during the war. Practical, focused, obsessed with results. But there is a deeper irony here, one that the engineers of 1940 could not have foreseen. The proximity fuse, this weapon of destruction, was also a triumph of preservation. It preserved ships that would otherwise have been sunk. It preserved lives that would otherwise have been lost. It preserved fleets and missions and, in a very real sense, the possibility of victory. It was a tool of war that saved more than it destroyed, a weapon whose greatest achievement was not the enemies it killed, but the friends it kept alive. This is the paradox at the heart of defensive technology. To build something that destroys in order to protect, to make killing more efficient so that fewer must die. The proximity fuse did not end war. It did not make the world safer in any lasting sense. But it changed the mathematics of survival, and in doing so, It gave time for fleets to regroup, for offensives to be launched, for strategies to be executed. Time, in war, is measured in lives, and the proximity fuse bought time by the tens of thousands. There is a final scene worth imagining, though no photograph records it. Somewhere in the Pacific, in the summer of 1945, a sailor stands on the deck of a destroyer. The war is nearly over, though he does not know it yet. Above him, the sky is empty, blue and infinite. The guns are silent. He thinks of the months of combat, the nights spent at battle stations, the sound of the 5-inch guns firing, the flash and crack of shells exploding unseen overhead. He does not know about the proximity fuse, does not understand the technology inside the shells he helped load. He knows only that fewer bombers made it through, that more ships came home, that he is alive, and that this fact, this simple fact of survival, is a kind of miracle. In that moment, he is touching something larger than himself, larger than the ship, larger than the war. He is touching the edge of a truth that will define the decades to come. That survival, in a technological age, depends not just on courage or strength, but on the ability to think faster, to adapt quicker, to make tools that can respond to threats the human mind cannot fully perceive. The proximity fuse was one such tool. And it was born not from aggression but from necessity, not from a desire to conquer but from a need to endure. This is the legacy of those men in the munitions building in January 1940, staring at photographs of shattered ships and blooming, useless smoke. They could not stop the war from coming, but they could change the odds. They could take the vast, indifferent geometry of the sky and make it just a little less hostile, just a little more survivable. And in doing so, they saved not just ships and sailors, but the idea that science, applied with precision and purpose, could be a force for preservation in a world bent on destruction. The proximity fuse was a small thing, a handful of tubes and wires, a whisper of radio waves, but it was enough. In the mathematics of war, where every variable matters and every equation is written in blood, it was enough to tip the balance, and in the end, that is what technology does. It does not replace courage or sacrifice, it does not make war noble or clean, but it gives those who fight a chance to act, to defend, to survive. And sometimes, in the narrow margins between victory and defeat, between life and death, that chance is everything. The clock in the munitions building kept ticking. The war came, as everyone knew it would, but when the dive bombers fell from the sky over American fleets, the shells that rose to meet them were no longer blind. They could see, they could sense, and in that sensing, in that instant of recognition and response, was a new kind of power. Not the power to destroy, though that was part of it, but the power to decide, the power to say, not here, not now, not to us. That power, born in a basement laboratory in 1940, changed air defense forever. And the sky, once vast and indifferent, became a place where machines could think, where tools could adapt, where the future arrived one small explosion at a time.